Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hillary. Andrew Hall is the Director of Strategic Engagement at Webhelp UK. He only just joined Webhelp in January this year, although he's enjoyed a long career focused on CX, and he joined Webhelp from Capgemini, where he was the Head of Innovation for Customer Engagement. Andrew got in touch with me because of a recent podcast with Martin Hill-Wilson on Emotive CX. We started a conversation about the podcast on LinkedIn, and it seemed appropriate to continue the conversation here on the podcast so everyone can hear his ideas. Now, Martin was talking about Emotive CX, and in particular, Andrew's point is that he wants to reassure people that when applied well, technology can still lead to some great CX solutions. It's not mandatory that if you're innovative, you need to lose all human empathy. Okay, that's enough for the introduction, so let's go straight to the interview with Andrew Hall. Okay, so you contacted me recently because you heard the podcast I did with Martin Hill-Wilson on Emotive CX and not losing the human touch in the customer experience. So tell me a bit more about, why you responded to that conversation with Martin.
So Martin and I meet infrequently, I would say, in Milton Keynes. We're both Milton Keynesites, and we meet for coffee, and we end up having the typical kind of conversations that Martin has with people. My background is fairly technology-led, although I'm also played a long time in the outsourcing space as well. So very much looking at the agents and how organisations then join up the role of technology to the role of agents, and how bringing those two together, it isn't the easiest bedfellows, I don't think. And I think organisations sometimes struggle to quite understand, the disruptive technologies that are out there that can support agent conversations, while at the same time recognizing that there is an emotional side, a human side to a conversation that I think, people pay lip service to a lot of the time. I think especially when you start to talk about the new world of bots, and suddenly, we need to talk about humanizing the bots and all of this kind of thing, which I think is utter nonsense, really. But I think there is a lot of work to do around, giving agents the right empowerment, the right tools, both in terms of that human EQ, the empathy that they show, but also the support in trying to do the work that they're doing.
Yeah, that's interesting because what Martin was talking about was being able to use human conversation rather than humanizing the technology itself. So, given that you're working with technology that helps to improve conversations, how are you making that happen at Webhelp then?
Well, I think it's interesting. There's a story I tell, and just before I kind of answer that question, because I think they're both important. So I used to run a music charity, and we had what we did would help young people with their social engagement and social inclusion by bringing them into a music studio and getting them focused on music and doing lots of engagement around music. And we had a young guy come to us from the social services, and he came into us one day and he said, the social services said, we can't get anything out of him. We think he likes to rap. Maybe he'll do some work with you. And he started to write these rhymes with us over a few weeks, and eventually said that I'd like to put something down. So we created a backing track for him, and then he put this story down, and it was the story of him coming up, being born in Sierra Leone, seeing his mum and dad die. As his mum and dad died, he was drawn into the children's army, ended up shooting people, was drawn out of that from a person that was a little bit of an older mentor for him, and between them somehow, a very young teen age, he came up from the Sierra Leone through Africa and then through Europe and then up into the UK and ended up with the social services in the UK. And I think about that, and then I think about what we're trying to do in contact centres, and I think, we've got people from such diverse backgrounds as him, and his name that he gave himself was the Army Boy. Now, he's of an age now where he will be calling people to buy car insurance, to book a holiday, to buy a new phone, and he will be having conversations with those people from an incredibly troubled and intense background, talking to someone who is likely from an incredibly different background. And I think what we do when we bring organizations contact centers together with people is we don't often think about that. We don't think about the fact that actually this is fundamentally a conversation that's happening between two people. And therefore, if that conversation is going to work, people need to be able to have the conversation and not just preach about the product and go through the rigmarole of the regulated requirements that are there for each of the stages of the sale or management of the service, etc. So when the reason I joined Webhelp, and I've only just joined them, was because they rebranded everything, much in the way that I did when I was at Capgemini with Odigo. We worked very hard on looking at the human side of everything. And so in Webhelp, they focus very much on that human engagement, that human conversation, making things easy to engage with from a human perspective. And in Odigo, Capgemini, my previous life, we worked very hard on how Odigo would enable those human conversations. And I think there is a natural coherence between the two. When you get it right, one drives the insight and the awareness and the understanding, perhaps even real-time sentiment, real-time next best action, and so forth through a whole range of different technologies that are out there nowadays. Being able to deliver much better qualification up front, to be able to understand, the history that someone's had with your organization, why they might be calling, to pick up the tonality in their voice, the intent of why they're calling, because often we find that people are saying one thing and meaning another, right? And so when they come into an organization, to pick up that intent and maybe get up the not only the primary reason they're talking about, but maybe to identify the second and the third reason maybe why they're calling, and then use that as a way to then predict where to put them in an organization. That's becoming quite advanced in terms of how you then start to use technology. Being able to bring context through from a chatbot over to the agent, and being able to make a chatbot not only something that's outward facing, but effectively a swivel chair that can turn into where the agent is as well, so that chatbot brings with it all of the intent and the understanding and the transcript of what happened with the customer when it was outward facing. So now you're starting to empower conversations both ways, both with the customer in terms of those early NLP type conversations with the chatbot, but then also inward facing back into the agent, where now the chatbot could even trigger off case management capabilities that are in tools like Pega, for example, where you might want to create or automatically open a case based on the intent that you identify. And I think as we start to get more advanced in how we use technology, and couple that then with actually recognizing that we need agents and advisors who are really competent with having that level of engagement with someone like the Army boy, but equally with someone like a Cambridge graduate who's probably a very, very different demographic to him. We stand a much better chance, I think, of having conversations that actually mean something. Because I do feel sorry for contact centers. They're often fraught with lots of technology challenges. They're often fraught with a huge amount of stats, targets, SLAs, KPIs that they need to achieve. But really the technology and the way that they train their agents and the insights they have when people are coming in aren't sufficient to be able to really help them to drive those up as quick as they should.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, as you're introducing some of these technologies like the NLP chatbot, chatbots that you can actually just converse with, are you finding that there's any sort of demographic issues? I mean, are younger customers more accustomed to interacting with the bot, for example? And, do older customers not accept it?
We don't see that. In fact, interestingly, some of our research has shown that younger generation actually like to engage with email more than they do chatbots, which was a bit of a surprise. We just did some work with YouGov, and that was one of the findings that we actually had from there. But I think the whole chatbot piece of work is kind of interesting. And when you look at the generations, you've got the baby boomers, you've got the Gen X, millennials, and Gen Zs, and so forth. I talk about millennials as the transitional generation. Really they're the generation that are transitioning from a fairly low-tech environment to a fairly high-tech environment. and they've kind of grown through the pains. They've got the growing pains of coming out of that, and so their engagement with it, I think, is slightly different, and therefore their social engagement and how they grew up, I think, is very different to how the younger people, the Gen Zs and the Alphas, the very young ones, are engaging with technology. So, my younger kids, who are the Gen Zs, are much more adaptable to that kind of technology, for sure. Absolutely, they are. And if you look at the way my 2-year-old picks up the microphone on the television or speaks to Google Home, and has a conversation and gets Peppa Pig to play magically on the television, when he can't even write, I think that's quite incredible. So yes, they're growing up in an environment where that is what they do, and they engage with their social groupings much more online, I think, than they do face to face a lot of the time. Or certainly they're able to expand their social groupings online in a far greater way than maybe the older generation. But the older generation do engage. I talk about my mum and her use of Facebook. She took a long time to get onto Facebook because she didn't see the value of it. And a lot of people listening to this might not see the value of it. But to her, once she realized actually she could see pictures of her family, and there were a few friends that she could chat with on there, it had a degree of value, but she had to associate using Facebook with value before she actually decided to go and use it. Whereas if you take the younger generation, they're high adopters. So when Instagram comes out, I want to have a go. When TikTok comes out, I want to have a go, and so forth and so on. And all of these things start to drive in a very the younger generation tend to drive them much faster. But they also trail off much faster as well. So one of the challenges organizations have, and again, this is why the conversation is important across all of these channels, is that it's just keeping up with the channels as they evolve. It's one thing to say, I want to have an omni-channel capability, but actually what you need is a provider that can keep all of those channels being delivered to you, or can adopt those channels on your behalf if you're coming to someone like a Webhelp for an outsourcing arrangement. And that's not always easy, right? Because those channels are there's a multitude of them. How do you engage your customers across each of them? So it was an interesting conversation. We changed focus from being omni-channel, and I don't like the word omni-channel. I did for a while, but I don't like the word omni-channel because I think it's been seen as the end point, whereas to me it's a transitional point in itself. It's a means to an end. And having an environment that is omni-channel is therefore then an enabler to creating the right journeys with your customers. And actually, I'm more focused on the journeys and how we transform organizations to be able to deliver journeys across those channels. And therefore, as new channels come in, it's just a new channel you add in. But the main thing is actually the journey that goes across it and being able to deliver all of those. So I think in summary to your question, I think that young people adopt quickly. They tail off quickly as well. The older generations still adopt, but a lot slower, but they won't adopt a lot of the channels that I just think are probably too complex for them and maybe just, not in their space. It's particularly some of the heavy graphical and video-led kind of channels.
Yeah, and one of the problems to do with the journey is the inability, quite often, something I've seen with chatbot installations, is the inability to switch between the bot and the human, either when the bot is confused or where the bot doesn't have a satisfactory answer. So you get kind of stuck in a loop. And I've had this myself several times. I mean, I had a long ongoing problem with PayPal where I couldn't reset my PayPal account and I couldn't get beyond the bot. Do you think that, many of these difficulties about, not being able to switch over to a human when you really need to, is it just because you've got a rushed implementation or it's just not well designed?
I was having a conversation with someone from a government agency about a year ago, and I was describing deflection. And if you remember when we started putting chat in and chat bots in and all of this, it was seen as a way to reduce the voice channel. Well, we all know that that's not actually what's going to happen. In actual fact, it's the inverse. Voice tends to go up as you introduce these channels, partly because there is a higher failure demand, and therefore voice is the obvious channel to be able to sort that out. But I think what happened was that somehow during this move to digital, I think organizations didn't evolve their voice. What they did was to say, right, voice is a legacy channel, and there's lots of people that were talking about that at the time, and lots of predictions that voice was going to drop down to, 10, 20% of your volume, which from a volume of around 65% or whatever it is today. And so they put it to one side, and they said, we'll leave voice and we'll go to chat, and then eventually we'll try chatbot as well. And so they started a deflection strategy. That deflection strategy would just move people quickly into digital, and then move people, in theory, move people away from voice. But it blocks them. It locked them into a channel where they couldn't move. And quite frankly, the conversation wasn't always best on a chat in the early days. People had to learn how to have a conversation in chat. And chatbots are a whole different level, right? So, the chatbot is fairly transactionally led at the moment still, I would say. I still think that, certainly machine learning in chatbots is almost non-existent. The majority of chatbots are all assisted learning, and I think they will be for some time in this environment. And they can't pick up all of the meaning and the intent, and I find them often what they are is advanced routing ASR type capabilities, where you really just use them as a way to route someone into your organization with hopefully a little bit of understanding. And I think they're still lacking. I think this whole area is still quite immature, and I don't think that they necessarily carry across the right context to an agent when they can transfer either. So I think there's a lot of maturing in this space to do. But when it works well, as I talked about the swivel chair action, when it works well and it can turn itself back to the agent, and they do exist, but you'll just have to spend a bit more to get them to work properly, then the experience is fantastic. I'm a huge advocate of chatbots, but I think we overplay chatbots. I think chatbots are, sometimes actually what you need is just a really, really good, maybe a machine learning led or whatever, but FAQ environment on your website or whatever will stop you to have to put chatbots in for another 2-3 years maybe. If you can get that FAQ to work well, most people just kind of ignore FAQs and think they can move straight to a chatbot, and I don't think that's always necessary.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us around to innovation, because I know that's one of your areas of interest at Webhelp. But there's a sort of paradox with innovation, because you're working with your clients on delivering something that they expect. You need to keep delivering day after day great customer service for your clients. But innovating means testing new ideas, and not every idea works. So in a CX environment, how do you work with clients on innovating the customer service delivery and at the same time keeping the lights on?
So I think that traditionally in outsourcing, this has been an area where there's been lots of promise, but it's always under-delivered. And it's under-delivered for two reasons. Number one is I think that the outsourcers were, and let's be honest, outsourcing has had a bit of a bad rap in the last few years for lots of very good reasons. Often because the outsourcer would do a deal and they would what in the old days we used to call castling. They'd put walls up around it and keep their P&L safe and therefore their profit safe. They would build into that 15% risk so they can protect their margins against failures and SLAs. And they would build into that a 3 or 4% continual improvement, because that's typically what customers were after. And that would allow them to run the contract for a 5-year term and be fairly sure that they would make reasonable margins, albeit very poor in terms of comparison to consulting and so forth. And that would be typically the way it would work. So what you're doing is building in failure demand into the contract because you're going to fail. And for me, that's always been something I've struggled with. Because I've much more proactively design a service that was more partner-led and one where we could work with the customer to build a service that was going to improve. And I use the analogy of I'm holding my very incredible smartphone, which we mustn't forget is only a decade old. Since it started, and the amazing development that this has got in 10 years is outstanding. You give an outsourcer a smartphone now and say, look after that for 5 years for me, and in 5 years' time they gave you that phone back without having done much to it, other than a little bit of continual improvement, they're going to be so outdated and their relevance to the market is going to be lost. I mean, it's just not going to be there anymore. So I think we've moved into a new era with outsourcers where you have to be partner-led. You have to be, thinking about how you can engage together. So to your point, exactly to your point, the way that we work within Webhelp is very transformational. So we don't see ourselves as just going in as a traditional outsourcer and saying, yeah, we'll take your seats, we'll put them offshore, we'll arbitrage wherever we can, and we'll give you a 3 or 4% improvement every year. What we try and do is to say, actually, let's be much more dynamic. We create sprints with them. We use Agile a lot within our centres. We use model offices to enable us to be able to do rapid design improvements around centres. And when we work with our clients see significant increases in productivity, significant increases in their business outcomes, their SLAs, so net promoter scores, first contact resolution, ease of doing business, and so forth. All these key metrics that are recognised today, they're the ones that we want to focus on with our clients, rather than a 3%, 5% average handling time and all of the usual kind of gubbins that go with outsourcing. So I think that's what we're doing today with our clients, and I think that will continue to evolve. And it's almost like taking a lot of what the back office outsourcers, the business process services companies of old were doing for back office, is what we're now doing for front office. And I think it's a hugely exciting area because it also brings into it lots of automation, RPA around fulfillment of services from the front office. So being able to take activity out of a chatbot or out of a chat session or out of a voice session even, and then fulfilling that through to the back end using an RPA environment or an API-based tool set, to be able to make real transactions happen from front to back in a much more rapid way. And then we combine that with the ability to be able to offshore the right roles to the right places and not just say we want everything to go to the Philippines, because the Philippines can't do everything, or sending it to South Africa or keeping it in the UK. It's about optimization of those roles against the technology we use and against the partnership approach that we've got with the organizations we work with. And that's why I joined Webhelp, because they are doing something quite different in that space to anything I've seen anywhere.
Yeah, and I think the partner's the key word there, isn't it? Because that used to only ever
be
that used to be used as a sales technique. We're going to partner with you for the future, and the kind of environment you're talking about is, the CX expert, a company like Webhelp, but you've basically got the expertise that the client hasn't got, so you've become genuine partners.
Yeah, absolutely. And I haven't. In fact, I'm up at our model office in Liverpool tomorrow, and I'm really excited to kind of really see that in action, because I've only been in the company for a while, but so it'll be my sheep deep into that environment. But everything that we've done there is absolutely incredible, and to see that kind of level of improvement is amazing. And I think we need to try and move away from that kind of. There was a famous supplier manager in a bank who, and I was talking to a friend the other day about him, and I remember sitting in a car park outside McDonald's, and his mantra was let's do the deal, Andrew. Yeah, that's fine. What is it? £5.90 an hour. Okay, that's great. I'll do the deal at £5.89. What? So you need me to change my work hour with 1 pence? Yeah, that's what I'll do, and then I'll get the deal. And then he was asking my friend to go in and speak to his team of outsource buyers about the effect of squeezing an outsourcer down to the last penny. So having done it to me, he then asked someone to go in and explain why it's a bad thing.
Yeah.
And I think we still live in that world. I think we still live in a world where suppliers are forced down and down and down and down, and that's and we qualify out of those opportunities. We won't do those because we don't think it's good for the customer. It's certainly not good for our margin and the kind of business that we're trying to achieve. And we think we can achieve a lot more for customers. If we take on a new modern way of sourcing that is much more outcome led and positive, and we're prepared to stand behind that and underwrite that, because we want to be a partner that can adapt and change along the life cycle of a contract.
Okay, that's great. I mean, and then finally, because we've just been talking about innovation, changing partnerships. I mean, if you were looking out into the rest of the year, what is it that you're most excited about? What should we be looking out for?
I think everything I've just said. So for me, I think it's really interesting. You've got Gartner who are saying to people, outsource only the essential stuff. And what I see is people actually saying, I'm really interested in doing something different. And I think that as long as we carry on in that trend where people are looking and saying, I need to transform, and actually organizations, I use a term called change equilibrium, and it was really referencing to a bank at one point, but I think the term applies generally, is that a lot of organizations try and do change, but it's really peripheral change. It's change on the outside. It's the outer shell, if you like, of the egg. It's not the soft piece in the middle. And I think that all too often what happens is they apply change, they spend a lot of money doing that, but actually it doesn't really have a real effect. And this applies to how people manage brands as well. I think they dabble on the outside, but maybe actually getting that conversation, back to our original point, getting that conversation really right and getting that delivered well, we can see people respond much better to authentic conversations than they do to lots of ramblings. So I think as organizations kind of start to address the core, then companies like us, in Webhelp, we can start to really help to affect that change and to drive some change and move beyond this kind of sense of change paralysis, where I don't think organizations fundamentally are actually making much difference. I mean, the reason I came up with that term was because when I was speaking to a change director, a transformation director of the bank, he was more interested in talking about how to do mortgages on WhatsApp than he was about actually changing the bank. And that stressed me out quite a lot. I found that wrong, because I think there's so many things that do need to happen. So I think that that's probably the first one, is I think that organizations do want to do something different, and we're absolutely there to support that. And then I think the second one for me is I think there is the whole thing around voice and the use of voice, I think, is going to change, and I think we'll start to see much more voice bots start to become normal, and that technology is evolving. And I think as you see, Google's ability and Amazon's ability and other people's really to start to get more accurate around their speech to text transcriptions, then we can start to drive much more predictability around the use of that kind of capability. So I think you'll see voice come in a lot more, and that will come in also through the likes of Alexa and the Google Home and so forth, where you'll be able to have much more conversationally led transactions that are more accurate and become more part of the core. But because you're optimizing those, the cost of that channel will obviously continue to drop as well, and we'll see a lot more improvement in that, and then that will in itself then lead to the conversations with the agents that are more human based, because you get the EQ right with the agent and the affinity correct with the customer through the mix of technology and the mix of the emotional engagement that the agent is trained in.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. Please take a moment to review the podcast, because this helps other listeners to find it. And if you have any suggestions, then get in touch with me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm @Mark Hillary with 2 L's, or just search Google for Mark Hillary.